There comes a moment, quiet, deliberate, and irreversible, when a man doesn't raise his voice, doesn't offer closure, doesn't argue or explain. He simply turns around, walks through a door that no longer belongs to him, and never looks back. Not out of anger, not out of weakness, but out of something far more terrifying: clarity. You see, most people are prepared for confrontation, for noise, for an explosion they can respond to. What they're never prepared for is silence. Not the kind that manipulates, but the kind that ends, absolutely, without apology, without leftovers. And so when you vanished, truly vanished, not by pulling back slowly, not by leaving breadcrumbs of your existence, but by erasing your presence with precision, they didn't feel relief. They didn't feel freedom. They felt a fracture in their reality, a void so foreign it made them question everything they thought they controlled. Because in that one act of silent departure, you didn't just exit their world. You shattered their illusion, the illusion that you'd always be there, the illusion that your forgiveness was infinite, that your patience was guaranteed, that your presence was cheap and your love was replaceable. But what if I told you your disappearance was never about them? What if the silence wasn't a weapon, but a boundary sharpened by pain, discipline, and truth? Because true Stoic silence isn't avoidance. It's not revenge. It is the highest form of emotional dominance, a rejection of chaos, a refusal to be consumed, a rebirth into sovereignty. So if you've ever wondered what truly happens when you're just gone, not lost, not forgotten, but intentionally absent, stay with me. Because what they feel in your absence isn't even the real story. The real story begins at stage 10, when you stop needing to be understood and start becoming untouchable. They never truly feared losing you, not because they didn't understand your worth, but because they never truly believed you would leave. In their mind, you were a constant, a fixture, a reliable source of warmth and attention that would always be available, no matter how many times they dismissed your voice, ignored your needs, or treated your presence like a background song they could mute at will and expect to play again whenever they wished. They mistook your consistency for dependency, your patience for passivity, your love for weakness. And in doing so, they built a quiet fantasy where they held the reins, where your emotions danced to the rhythm of their mood, where you were always within reach even when they pushed you away. So when you vanished, not with a scream or a slammed door, but with the cold, unwavering stillness of a man who has made peace with his decision, they didn't just lose you, they lost something far more destabilizing. They lost their sense of control. And make no mistake, that loss doesn't land like a whisper. It crashes like a storm they never saw coming. And the irony is, they were the ones who forecasted sunny skies forever, assuming you'd always orbit their needs like a sun that never sets. But when you go silent, truly silent, without explanation, without hesitation, without leaving a trail, they don't feel abandoned. They feel powerless. And that is a sensation they have spent their entire life trying to avoid, deny, and suppress. It's like a drug addict waking up to find the supply is gone. Not hidden, not withheld as punishment, but vanished entirely, as if it never existed. And suddenly they are left shaking, pacing, playing out old memories like they were trying to reheat a flame that no longer burns. They scroll through old messages, they stare at photos, they play conversations in their head, not because they miss you, but because they're trying to locate the moment they lost control of something they believed they owned. Because that's what you were to them. Not a person, but a certainty, a resource, a lifeline they never thought they'd have to live without. And now, without you responding, without you explaining, without you reacting, they are forced to realize the truth they've avoided all along. The power they thought they had was never real. It was borrowed, and you just took it back. And nothing shakes the human ego more violently than discovering the illusion of control was exactly that, an illusion. So let them spiral, let them grasp, let them ache, because silence doesn't just break the connection, it breaks the framework they used to define it. And when that collapses, all that's left is a soul, unmasked and afraid, whispering to itself in disbelief, "Is this real? Did I really lose him? Or did I ever have him at all? At first, they convince themselves that your absence is tolerable, that the silence you've left behind is nothing more than a quiet weekend storm passing through, that they'll wake up in a day or two and everything will go back to how it was, that somehow you'll fold, you'll return, you'll reappear like you always did, ready to forgive, ready to repair, ready to refill the well they kept drawing from without ever asking if it was running dry. But as the hours stretch into days and the days into weeks, something unexpected settles in. Not just the dull ache of missing someone, but a far more unnerving emptiness, one that wraps itself around their daily life like a foam, not loud or violent, but cold, persistent, and unshakably real. They try to silence it, they try to drown it, with casual flings, loud nights, busy schedules, endless scrolling, anything that might simulate the energy you once brought so effortlessly. Yet everything they reach for feels like cardboard soaked in water, flimsy, shallow, incapable of warmth. Because the truth is, you weren't just someone they lost. You were the fire in the cold room, the pulse in the stillness, the invisible structure holding up the emotional architecture they thought was their own. Now, with you gone, the walls remain, but the life inside has disappeared. What's left are hollow echoes and rooms that feel colder with every passing thought of you. They sit across from strangers, hoping for laughter that feels real, hoping for a gaze that ignites something. Anything. But every attempt at distraction is shadowed by the growing realization that nothing and no one fills the space you once occupied. Not because you were perfect, but because what you gave was real. And real isn't easily replaced. And the more they search for you and others, the more exhausted they become. Because deep down, they know this isn't about you anymore. It's about the version of themselves they only ever saw through your presence. A version now fading in your absence. Let them sit with that void. Let them fill it with noise and movement and pretense. And when it all collapses in the silence of a 3 a.m. thought they can't shake, they'll remember. You were never just a man. They mistook a fortress or a doorway. And if you're watching this, nodding quietly because you've felt that fire drain from someone's life, the moment you stepped out, then you're not alone. This is your reminder. The moment you stop chasing, stop explaining, and start holding your own space in silence is the moment you reclaim your power. This is true Stoic way. And if that path speaks to something in you, not the pain, but the peace beneath it, then don't just watch from a distance. Join the brotherhood, subscribe, rebuild in silence, rise without noise. Because the void they feel, it's just proof that you were never easy to replace. There is a certain hunger, not of the body, but of the mind, that begins to grow when a person who once had full access to your life suddenly finds themselves locked out, not with a slammed door or a shouted goodbye, but with that terrifying, unwavering stillness that gives them nothing, answers nothing, and leaves everything to the imagination. At first, they dismiss it, brushing off the quiet as a phase, telling themselves that you're just playing a game, trying to provoke a reaction, and that any moment now, the notifications will light up again. The familiar tone of your message will break the silence, and the old rhythm will return. Predictable, dependable, safely under their control. But then it doesn't, and that's when the hunger begins. Not for you exactly, but for information. For fragments of proof that you're still circling somewhere in their orbit, that you haven't truly detached, that they still have some thread, however thin, tying them to your emotional gravity. They begin searching, subtly at first, almost playfully, checking your Instagram stories, scrolling your profile, glancing at the timestamp on your last scene, looking for signs of life, not out of care, but out of need. Because curiosity is the parasite of the ego, and when the ego is denied clarity, it festers. Soon, curiosity turns to compulsion. They ask mutual friends where you've been, try to phrase their questions casually. Have you heard from him lately? But their voice gives them away, and the desperation wrapped in nonchalance becomes impossible to ignore. They reread old conversations, scrolling through texts they once left on read, now dissecting every word, wondering what they missed, what signs they overlooked, what moments of quiet were actually cries for space they never answered. And the more silence you give them, the more their mind begins to turn against them, inventing scenarios, projecting fantasies, and torturing itself with visions of you happier, lighter, even loved by someone else. This is the madness that follows a man who reclaims his silence. This is the price they pay for mistaking access as eternal. Because in a world obsessed with constant connection, silence becomes the most aggressive absence, and your refusal to be seen, heard, or found becomes a mirror to their loss, not of your presence, but of the power they thought they had over it. And here's the quiet truth most never say aloud. The less they know about you, the more space you take up in their mind. You are no longer a man in their life. You are now a question they cannot answer. And that, brother, is what makes you unforgettable. There comes a moment, always quiet, always unplanned, when the noise of distraction dies down, when the false laughter fades, when the texts they hoped would replace yours fall flat, unanswered, or unfulfilling. And in that stillness, something darker begins to surface. Not curiosity, not longing, but confrontation. Not with you, but with the version of themselves they've spent months, maybe years avoiding. They begin to ask the question they were once too proud, too blind, or too self-righteous to consider. Was I the problem? And though it enters their minds softly, like a whisper of doubt, it quickly gains weight because when no one is left to blame, when the silence continues no matter how many indirect attempts they make to draw you back in, when they realize your absence is not a strategy, but a state of peace, you've become untouchable, and they are left standing alone before the only judge they cannot manipulate, their own conscience. That's when the memories begin to resurface, not the sweet ones, not the highlight reel they used to justify the relationship in public, but the forgotten frames, the ignored texts that now feel like open wounds, the phone calls dismissed with tired excuses, the vulnerable moments you offered that were laughed off, minimized, or brushed aside because they thought you'd never leave, because they thought you'd always come back, because they believed your love was self-replenishing and without limit. They remember your eyes in that one conversation they cut short. They hear the pause in your voice on the night they didn't ask if you were okay. They revisit the small, silent sacrifices you made. Sacrifices they didn't notice until the giving stopped and the silence took their place. And now, in the quiet, that guilt becomes a ghost. Not loud or violent, but ever present, drifting behind every thought, echoing through every moment where they once felt powerful, now infected by the knowledge that they were not just careless, they were complicit in their own loss. And what torments them most is not the memory of your love, but the mirror it held up to them, the one they smashed each time they dismissed your needs, thinking they were choosing freedom, not realizing they were pushing away the only person who ever saw them without flinching. Because when you were present, they were never forced to face themselves. But now, with nothing left to hold, no one left to convince, and nowhere left to look except inward, the truth becomes unbearable. They weren't just careless with your love, they were reckless with their own reflection. And the guilt, now awake, doesn't scream. It whispers over and over in the language of consequence. He saw me, and I let him go. It always starts small, subtle, almost harmless, like a breeze testing the surface of still water. A late-night message with no context, just a quiet, "Hey," sent at 1:43 a.m. when the room is dark and the guilt louder than sleep, followed by another the next night, and then another, longer this time. I've been thinking about you a lot. They don't mean to beg, not yet, but the cracks have started to spread. Soon they're reacting to your old posts, liking photos from 6 months ago they pretended not to see when you were still giving, still waiting, still hoping they'd match the depth you brought every day without asking for recognition. They drop half-hearted comments under things you've forgotten you even posted, all in the hopes that you'll see them, notice them, offer even a breadcrumb of response. Because now, in their quiet panic, they would give anything for the validation they once ignored. This isn't love. It's fear wearing a familiar face. They send "I miss you," not because they've grown, but because they have lost their grip on the dynamic they believed would never shift. The moment you stopped orbiting them, they lost the gravity that kept their ego afloat. And now, in your absence, they are drowning in the weight of everything they didn't say when it mattered. You read the messages, you feel the pull, but you don't respond. Because you've seen this pattern before. The shallow remorse, the performative regret, the sudden desire for reconnection that always appears when their comfort is threatened. Not when they truly see you, but when they realize they can't use you anymore. You're not bitter, you're not playing games. You've simply evolved. Now they chase, but you're not standing still anymore. And that's what terrifies them. Because chasing someone who's still waiting is a game, but chasing someone who's moved on, that's a reckoning. You've stopped being the man who answers every cry, who believes every apology, who mistakes attention for affection. You've become someone else entirely, not colder but clearer, not harder but wiser. And so while they type and delete, stalk and scroll, panic and project, you breathe, you heal, you remain untouched. And that silence, once mistaken as absence, is now your most powerful presence. In the immediate aftermath of your silence, before the weight of absence truly settles, before the void has time to stretch its limbs and make itself at home in the quiet corners of their mind, there exists a brief, almost intoxicating high, a false clarity they mistake for liberation, a rush of supposed freedom that whispers, "Finally, I don't have to deal with them anymore." And for a moment, it works. They step outside, breathe in the night air, pour a drink, swipe through their phone, laugh too loudly with people they barely know, and tell themselves they've been unshackled, that the emotional tension has evaporated, that now they can live without compromise, without accountability, without reflection. But that feeling, as seductive as it may be, is built on a foundation of sand, because what they believe to be freedom is not the absence of you, but the absence of emotional gravity. And without it, they don't float, they drift. And soon they begin to feel it. It creeps in quietly, always in the quad, during the long elevator rides when there's no one to text, in the early mornings when the bed feels too big, or in the middle of conversations that no longer carry the weight of shared history or depth. They look around at the people they thought would fill your place and realize those faces don't bring light, they bring noise. The laughter feels forced, the connections feel thin, and the sense of excitement they once imagined in your absence now starts to taste like cardboard. You see, what they called freedom was simply a break from responsibility. But now that you're gone, and not reacting, not responding, not returning, they begin to realize that your presence, while sometimes inconvenient to their ego, was the one thing that gave shape to their emotional landscape. Now everything feels flat, and here is where the illusion crumbles. Because true freedom is not found in detachment from others. It's found in alignment with someone who brings peace, depth, and meaning. You were not a cage. You were the compass. And now, without you, they are free only in the way a ship is free when it's lost at sea, with no anchor, no direction, and nothing but empty water in every direction. And the worst part, they don't even know which way is home anymore. When panic no longer hides behind silence, and the illusion of freedom collapses into fragments of regret too sharp to touch, they turn to the last refuge of those who still crave control but no longer possess the power to command it directly. They begin to play games, not because they believe it will bring you back in truth, but because they hope to stir even a flicker of attention, even a momentary pulse of reaction that would confirm, if only for a second, that you still see them. They post curated photos with exaggerated smiles taken in places that suddenly seem louder and more vibrant than they ever used to be. Write cryptic quotes about growth and independence, sprinkle hints of new connections and spontaneous adventures, all carefully arranged not to reflect their healing, but to provoke your jealousy. And when that fails to draw your gaze, they go further, turning their social media into a theater of performance, where every caption is a veiled creepong, every image an echo of desperation dressed as confidence. But here is the part that shatters them more than they expected. You don't react. You don't comment. You don't scroll. You don't even look. Not because you're cold, not because you're trying to win, but because the part of you that once cared enough to play the game has been buried beneath something far stronger: peace. And in that silence, not of words, but of attention, they experience the most humiliating truth of all. Not only have they lost your presence, they've lost their ability to matter. Because nothing disturbs the ego like invisibility, and when the tricks stop working, when every bait is left untouched, they begin to whisper to themselves the one sentence that shatters all pretense and bravado: he doesn't even hate me, he just doesn't see me anymore. And that to them is unbearable. Not because they miss you, but because they've been erased. In a world that thrives on noise, where typing dots and read receipts carry the weight of validation, where people text not to connect, but to confirm they still exist in someone else's world, there is no greater punishment, no greater judgment than the kind delivered without a single word. Because silence, true and unyielding, is not the absence of communication, but the presence of consequence. And once you've mastered it, you no longer need to explain anything to anyone. They thought silence was a pause. They thought it meant indecision, hesitation, maybe a tactical retreat, something temporary, something reversible. But what they never expected was that your silence wasn't an interruption in the story, it was the ending. And the only reason it feels unfinished to them is because they were never listening in the first place. Now they sit with it. Every moment they reach for their phone and find no new messages. Every time they scroll through memories hoping to catch a whisper of the connection you used to offer so freely, they are confronted not with your anger, but with your absence. And that, more than any insult, more than any confrontation, is what breaks them. Because silence is pure. Silence cannot be argued with, cannot be manipulated, cannot be undone. And while they crumble under the pressure of this deafening quiet, you, who once felt so much, who once pleaded with presence and tried to mend with words, now stand still, untouched, having discovered what few ever do, that to be silent is not to surrender, but to rise. Because you are no longer trying to be heard. You are no longer asking to be understood. You are the sword not yet drawn, silent, yes, but only because you've become far too sharp to be waved recklessly. And that silence they now fear, it's not punishment. It's poetry. It's discipline forged in fire. It is the true Stoic way, and only those strong enough to carry it know how heavy it truly is. It does not arrive with fanfare or warning, and it certainly doesn't come during moments of strength or clarity. Instead, it creeps in through the cracks they've tried so desperately to seal with denial, ego, and distraction, emerging slowly, like cold air under a locked door, carrying with it the one realization they cannot face without trembling: you might be gone for good. At first, it's just a thought, fleeting and unwelcome, easily pushed aside with a scroll, a drink, or a staged laugh. But thoughts, when ignored, tend to grow teeth, and before long, the fear is no longer a whisper in the background, but a constant pulse in their chest, asking the same quiet question on repeat: has he moved on? Because now the silence feels different. It no longer resembles space or stillness. It feels like distance, like finality, like a door that not only closed, but disappeared entirely. And what terrifies them most is not just the possibility that you're gone, but that you might be with someone who sees your worth without having to lose you first. The thought of your name spoken gently by another. The image of your eyes lit by new laughter. The possibility that you now belong to a world they no longer have access to. It begins to consume them, not because they miss you purely, but because they finally understand what your presence was, and more painfully, what your absence means. And now, everything they once dismissed begins to crash down with sharp, unforgiving precision. The nights they didn't show up, the calls they let ring out, the texts they left unanswered, the moments you needed reassurance but were met with silence or scorn, all now returning like ghosts, each carrying a fragment of the connection they carelessly shattered. But regret, no matter how loud, never arrives in time to undo what clarity has already made permanent. And though their heart now beats with fear, and their hands hover above messages they no longer have the right to send, it's no longer your forgiveness they seek. It's your attention, your acknowledgement, your eyes. And those, once freely given, are now gone. Because the cruelest part of awakening late is realizing the door hasn't just closed. It has vanished, and with it, the version of you that used to wait. This was never truly about them, not about the way they vanished emotionally long before you left physically, not about the half-truths or withheld affection, not even about the disrespect that eventually became routine. This was about something much deeper, something quieter, something sacred. The moment you stopped chasing validation and started remembering who you were before they convinced you that you weren't enough. Because there is a difference between silence that comes from pain and silence that comes from power. And you, without theatrics or bitterness, chose the second. You didn't disappear to teach them a lesson. You didn't vanish to make them suffer. You didn't pull away because you were too weak to stay. You walked away because you were finally strong enough to let go of everything that was breaking you while pretending to hold you together. That's not abandonment, that's rebirth. You stopped needing to be chosen, seen, or rescued. And in doing so, you became something few men ever find in this world of noise, reaction, and distraction. You became sovereign over your emotions, dignified in your restraint, and peaceful in your solitude. And now, standing in the stillness they once mistook for your defeat, you begin to see clearly that this path, though lonely at times and invisible to many, is the only path that leads back to yourself. Not the self who settled, begged, or hoped, but the self who remembers that healing is not loud and rebirth does not require permission. The boy you were would have explained himself. The man you are now simply walks in silence. And if there's one truth you carry forward from all of this, let it be this: you didn't lose someone who failed to value you. They lost someone who had finally learned to value himself. So now let them wonder, let them sit in the silence they once weaponized. Let them face the void they once accused you of creating. Because it was never your absence that hurt them. It was your awakening that exposed everything they tried to hide. And you no longer react. You no longer chase. You no longer shrink yourself to fit into frames built for lesser men. You rise wordless and whole, forged by the fire they lit and abandoned when it burned too bright. So if you've reached this point in your own story, if these words feel less like content and more like confirmation, then welcome. You're no longer a man reacting. You are a man becoming. This is the true Stoic way, and your silence is just the beginning.